The old man stood on the hilltop as the evening sun cast long shadows across his land. James Washington was not a man who showed much emotion, but today his eyes revealed a mixture of pride and sadness as he looked out over the rolling acres that had been in his family for generations. At 68, his hair had turned silver and deep lines marked his face, each one earned through years of protecting what was rightfully his. In his weathered hands, he held a yellowed piece of paper. The deed dated back to 1923, when his great-grandfather Solomon Washington had done something almost unheard of for a black man in the South. He had purchased 200 acres of prime land just outside what would eventually grow into the Atlanta suburbs. Nearly 100 years, James whispered to himself. The cool evening breeze carried his words away as he carefully folded the deed and placed it back in its protective sleeve. The story of how Solomon acquired this land had been told so many times around family dinner tables that it had almost taken on the quality of a legend. After escaping slavery as a young man, Solomon had worked tirelessly, saving every penny. He'd taken odd jobs, worked from sunrise to sunset, and eventually started a small business hauling goods between towns. When white business owners refused to work with him, he found ways around their barriers. When banks wouldn't lend to him, he created his own lending circle with other black families. James walked slowly down the hill, his boots crushing the tall grass beneath his feet. This land had seen so much: crops growing, children playing, family gatherings, and too many threats to count. There had been midnight visits from men in white hoods, suspicious fires, and countless legal challenges trying to claim the land through trickery and intimidation. But Solomon was smarter than all of them, James said with a smile, reaching the old oak tree where his great-grandfather had reportedly signed the final papers making the land his own. What few people knew, what no one outside the family knew, was that Solomon hadn't just bought the land. He protected it in ways that were still working today, almost a century later. With the help of a former Union soldier turned lawyer who'd believed in justice even when the rest of the South did not, Solomon had added special language to the deed. A covenant. A trap, some might call it, though James preferred to think of it as a shield. James sat down on the bench beneath the oak tree and opened the small leather folder he carried. Inside was a copy of the original covenant, its legal language complex but its meaning clear. Any attempt to take or use this land without proper Washington family permission would trigger consequences that would ensure justice, even if Solomon and his children weren't alive to see it. Nearby, just over the property line, James could hear the sounds of construction. For months now, bulldozers and work crews had been clearing the neighboring land, preparing to build some fancy new housing development. The noise didn't bother him much. He'd grown used to it, but lately the workers seemed to be getting closer. Just yesterday, he'd noticed survey stakes that seemed to be on his side of the boundary. James hadn't said anything yet. There was no rush. The covenant that Solomon had created had waited nearly 100 years to be tested. It could wait a little longer. As darkness began to fall, James stood up and walked back toward his house, the same house where he'd been born, where his father had been born, where generations of Washingtons had lived and died. From the top of his porch steps, he could see the lights of the construction site, and beyond that, the first few houses of what the signs called Meadowbrook Estates, luxury living coming soon. James smiled to himself. They had no idea what was coming. No idea at all about the lesson in history, justice, and foresight that Solomon Washington had prepared for them, a lesson a century in the making. Soon, he whispered as he opened his front door and stepped inside. Very soon. The sleek glass building downtown housed the offices of Crestview Partners, where Richard Whitman leaned back in his leather chair, looking out over the Atlanta skyline. At 52, he had built one of the most successful development companies in the Southeast. Today was a good day. The Henderson farm had finally sold after 3 years of negotiations. "This is going to be our crown jewel," Richard said, turning to face the team gathered in his office. He spread out a large map on the conference table, his finger tracing the outline of the newly purchased property. 200 acres of prime real estate just 20 minutes from downtown. We'll build the kind of homes people dream about. What Richard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that their surveys were wrong. The property they had purchased was indeed substantial, but it bordered the Washington family land, and the old boundary markers had faded or been moved over the decades. Their preliminary plans unknowingly included 75 acres that had belonged to the Washingtons since 1923. 2 months later, heavy yellow machines rolled onto the land. The sound of trees falling and earth moving filled the air from sunrise to sunset. Workers in hard hats measured and marked, following plans created in offices by people who had never walked the actual ground. No one noticed the old stone markers half buried in undergrowth that had marked the true property line for nearly a century. "Look at how fast they're moving," said one resident from the nearby town, watching from the road as the forest was cleared and the land graded. "They're building a whole new town out here." By spring, the framework of the first houses began to appear. Billboards went up along the highway. Meadowbrook Estates, luxury homes starting at $750,000. The advertisements showed smiling families standing in front of beautiful 2-story homes with perfectly manicured lawns. "Live the dream," the billboards promised. The construction continued through summer and into fall. Roads were paved, streetlights installed, and a grand entrance with a fountain and stone walls marked the community's boundary. The model home opened with great fanfare, drawing potential buyers from across the metro area. "This house has everything you could want," explained the sales agent to a young couple touring the property. 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, a gourmet kitchen, and a home office. And just wait until you see the community amenities: swimming pool, tennis courts, walking trails, and a clubhouse. What she didn't mention, because she didn't know, was that the walking trails and tennis courts sat squarely on Washington land. By winter, the first 10 families had moved in. They'd hung wreaths on their doors and put up holiday decorations, making the new houses feel like homes. In January, they held their first community meeting in a temporarily converted garage, since the clubhouse was still under construction. "I'm so glad we found this place," said one homeowner, a doctor who had recently relocated from Chicago. "It feels like we're in the country, but we're still close to everything." Another new resident nodded in agreement. "My kids love having so much space to play. And I love that we have an HOA to keep the neighborhood looking nice." They elected their first board that night, 5 homeowners who volunteered to manage the community's rules and finances. Eliza Jenkins, a retired school principal, became the president. She was organized and detail-oriented, qualities that would soon lead to an unexpected discovery. As more families moved in throughout the spring, the community began to take shape. Neighbors introduced themselves at mailboxes and property lines. Children made friends and rode bikes along the new sidewalks. Weekend barbecues became common, with the smell of grilling food drifting through the development. No one thought about the land they were living on, where it had come from, or who might have owned it before. No one except James Washington, who watched from his porch as the lights of the new houses began to twinkle in the evening, spreading across what had once been his family's fields. The residents of Meadowbrook Estates had no idea that their perfect new lives were built on someone else's history. They didn't know that the legal papers forming their HOA claimed authority over land that had never been sold. And they certainly didn't know about the century-old trap that was about to spring shut. Eliza Jenkins was not the type of person who left things unfinished. After 30 years as a school principal, she had developed a keen eye for details others missed. Now, as the newly elected HOA president of Meadowbrook Estates, she wanted to understand everything about the community she was responsible for. It was a rainy Tuesday morning when Eliza spread out the community documents on her dining room table. Coffee in hand, she began reviewing property maps, budgets, and the thick binder of regulations that governed their neighborhood. Something didn't add up in the annual budget projections. "That can't be right," she muttered, noticing that the landscaping costs seemed too low for the amount of common area shown on the community map. She pulled out her reading glasses and looked more closely at the property boundaries. The next day, Eliza drove to the county records office, a small brick building downtown that smelled of old paper and dust. The clerk behind the desk looked surprised when Eliza asked to see the historical property records for their area. "Most people just look those up online these days," the clerk said, leading her to a back room lined with shelves of large books and rolled maps. "I prefer to see the originals," Eliza replied, settling at a wooden table as the clerk brought over several heavy volumes. Hours passed as Eliza carefully compared the modern survey maps with historical records. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the windows when she suddenly sat up straight, her finger moving between two different maps. "This doesn't match," she whispered, placing the developer's survey next to a county survey from 1952. The boundary lines were clearly different. Eliza dug deeper, looking at older and older records until she found a detailed survey from 1925 that showed the original Washington property lines. The discovery hit her like a physical blow. According to these records, a significant portion of Meadowbrook Estates, including her own home, appeared to be built on land that still legally belonged to someone else. That evening, Eliza called an emergency meeting of the HOA board. The 5 of them gathered around her dining room table, faces growing increasingly worried as she explained what she'd found. "This has to be a mistake," said the board treasurer, a banker who had moved in just 3 months earlier. "The development company would have checked all this." "You would think so," Eliza agreed, "but look at these records. The Washington family has owned this land since 1923, and I can't find any record that they ever sold the eastern section where at least half our homes are built." "So what do we do now?" asked another board member, a young mother who had stretched her family's finances to afford their new home. "We need to talk to the developer first," Eliza decided. "They need to explain how this happened." The meeting with Richard Whitman at Crestview Partners' offices the following week did not go well. The developer's initial disbelief turned to dismissal as he looked at the documents Eliza had brought. "These are old records," he said with a wave of his hand. "Our legal team cleared all the titles before construction began. If there was some historical claim, it would have come up then." "But it didn't," Eliza insisted. "And now we have 156 families living on land that might not legally belong to them." Richard sighed and called in his head attorney, a stern-looking woman who examined the documents with growing concern. After a hushed conversation in the corner, Richard's confident demeanor had noticeably dimmed. "We'll look into this immediately," he promised, no longer making eye contact with the HOA board members. It took Crestview's legal team just 2 days to confirm Eliza's worst fears. A junior attorney arrived at her door unannounced, looking pale. "We found the issue," he explained, setting down a thick folder. "There was a mistake in the original survey. The Washington property line wasn't where we thought, and yes, approximately 75 acres of our development is on their land." "So what happens now?" Eliza asked, feeling a cold knot forming in her stomach. The young attorney swallowed hard. "That's the really concerning part. We found something else. A special covenant attached to the original Washington deed. It's unlike anything our senior partners have ever seen." He opened the folder and pointed to a highlighted paragraph. Apparently Solomon Washington, who bought the land originally, had this legal provision created that says if anyone builds on this land without permission, after a grace period, his voice faltered. "After a grace period, what?" Eliza pressed. "After a grace period, ownership of everything built on the land transfers to the Washington family. Everything. The houses, the roads, all of it." The gravel crunched under the tires as 3 expensive cars pulled up the long driveway to James Washington's house. The small delegation from Meadowbrook Estates had dressed in their business best, Eliza in a navy blue suit, Richard Whitman looking uncomfortable in his tailored jacket, and 2 attorneys carrying leather briefcases. James had been expecting them. Word travels fast in small communities, and he'd heard about the panic at the development company. He sat on his porch in a rocking chair that his father had made decades ago, watching calmly as the visitors approached. "Mr. Washington." Eliza stepped forward, extending her hand. "I'm Eliza Jenkins, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." James nodded and shook her hand. His grit was firm despite his age, his eyes sharp and knowing. "Been watching your houses go up for months now," he said, gesturing to the chairs on his porch. "Have a seat." They settled nervously into the offered chairs. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and the distant sound of birds. For a moment, no one spoke. Richard Whitman cleared his throat. "Mr. Washington, we've recently become aware of, well, a situation regarding property boundaries." He glanced at one of the attorneys, who opened a briefcase and removed some papers. "You mean how you built half your fancy development on my land?" James asked quietly, no anger in his voice, just simple truth. Richard's face flushed. There appears to have been an unfortunate error in our surveys. Our company takes full responsibility, and we're prepared to make it right." He nodded to the attorney, who handed James a document. "We're prepared to offer you $2 million for the disputed acreage. That's well above market value." James didn't even look at the paper. Instead, he reached beside his chair and picked up an old leather portfolio, its surface cracked with age. "Before we talk about your offer, there's something you should know." He opened the portfolio and carefully removed several yellowed documents. "My great-grandfather Solomon was a smart man. He had to be to survive. When he bought this land, he knew there would always be people trying to take it from him or his children." James handed the documents to Eliza rather than the attorneys. Solomon had help from a lawyer named Thomas Briggs. Briggs fought for the Union in the war and believed black folks deserved the same rights as anybody else. Together, they put special language in the deed, what the lawyers call a covenant. Eliza began reading, her expression changing from curiosity to shock. She passed the papers to the attorneys, whose reactions mirrored her own. "This can't be legally binding," one attorney muttered, flipping through the pages with growing alarm. "Property law doesn't work this way." "It did in 1923, James replied calmly. "And Mr. Briggs made sure it would still work today. My family has paid a lawyer every year for a century to keep those papers updated and legal." Richard leaned toward his attorneys. "What exactly does this covenant say?" he whispered, but not quietly enough. James answered for them. "It says that if anyone builds on Washington land without permission, they have 60 days to make it right through fair negotiation. After that, everything built on the land, every house, road, and fence post, becomes property of the Washington family." The color drained from Richard's face. "Everything? All 156 homes?" James nodded. "Everything." "But that would be hundreds of millions of dollars in property," Richard stammered. "You can't possibly enforce this." "I don't want your houses," James said simply. "Never did. My great-grandfather didn't create this covenant to take people's homes. He created it so that one day, someone like you would have to sit on my porch and listen." "Listen to what?" Eliza asked, finding her voice. James looked out toward the development, where families were living their lives, unaware that their futures hung in the balance. "To the truth, to my family's story. To understand what it means when you take something that doesn't belong to you." He turned back to face them. "You have choices now. You can fight me in court. Your lawyers against mine. We both know how that will end with these papers, or we can find a better way forward." Eliza leaned forward. "What would that better way be, Mr. Washington?" James smiled slightly. "That depends on whether you're ready to hear what Solomon would have wanted. He wasn't interested in revenge. He was interested in justice." The visitors exchanged glances, suddenly understanding that the man before them held not just their fate, but wisdom they hadn't expected. The $2 million they'd offered now seemed not just inadequate, but somehow missing the point entirely. The courthouse steps were crowded with news vans and reporters when James Washington arrived for the first day of the trial. Camera flashes lit up the morning air as he climbed the stairs, leaning slightly on a wooden cane carved from a tree that had grown on his family's land. "Mr. Washington, how do you feel about taking on one of the biggest developers in the state?" a reporter called out. James just smiled politely and kept walking. Beside him walked a young woman in a crisp charcoal suit, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. This was Amara Washington, James's granddaughter and a Harvard-educated attorney who had left her high-paying job at a New York law firm to represent her grandfather. "We'll make our statements in court," Amara told the reporters firmly, guiding her grandfather through the heavy wooden doors. Inside the courtroom, the contrast couldn't have been more striking. On one side sat Richard Whitman and Crestview Partners, with a team of 6 attorneys in expensive suits, surrounded by stacks of legal documents and leather briefcases. On the other side sat James and Amara, with just 2 additional attorneys and a much smaller pile of papers. As the judge entered, a hush fell over the packed room. Every seat was filled, with many people standing along the back wall. The case had captured national attention, with newspapers calling it the century-long land trap and television specials exploring the history of black land ownership in America. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Wilson," the bailiff announced. The judge, an older white man with silver hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, looked out over the courtroom. I understand there's significant public interest in this case, but I expect complete order in my courtroom. This will be decided on the law, not public opinion. Richard's lead attorney stood first, a tall man with perfectly styled gray hair. Your Honor, while we acknowledge that an unfortunate surveying error occurred, the covenant in question is simply unenforceable under modern property law. It attempts to create a penalty that is grossly disproportionate to any damages. The attorney paced confidently, gesturing with his hands. The Washington family has suffered no actual damages beyond the fair market value of the undeveloped land, which we have offered to pay at more than twice its worth. This covenant is essentially a trap set a century ago, waiting to spring on innocent homeowners who had no knowledge of this dispute. When it was Amara's turn to speak, she stood slowly and looked directly at the judge. Unlike the opposing counsel, she stayed behind the table, her voice calm and measured. Your Honor, this case isn't about a trap. It's about foresight, she said. My great-great-grandfather Solomon Washington didn't create this covenant out of malice. He created it out of necessity. Amara opened an old leather-bound book. I'd like to enter into evidence Solomon Washington's journal from 1923, the year he purchased this land. In it, he details 7 separate attempts by white landowners and officials to fraudulently take portions of his property in just the first year of ownership. The courtroom was silent as Amara read entries from the journal, describing threats, forged documents, and middle-of-the-night visits from men with torches. Solomon's clear, detailed writing brought the fear and determination of those days to life. Solomon Washington couldn't rely on the courts of his time to protect his land, Amara continued. So he created a legal mechanism that would ensure justice would eventually be served, even if it took generations. This wasn't a trap, it was protection. Over the following days, expert witnesses took the stand. Historians testified about the systematic theft of black-owned land throughout the early 20th century. Legal scholars analyzed the precise wording of Solomon's covenant, marveling at its careful construction. It's remarkable, said one elderly professor of property law. Whoever helped draft this document anticipated virtually every legal challenge that could be mounted against it. They created multiple layers of protection and tied it directly to the land itself, not just to the family's ownership. As the testimony continued, the mood in the courtroom shifted. What had initially seemed like an unreasonable claim began to make sense to many observers. Solomon's covenant wasn't just a legal oddity, it was a brilliant response to a deeply unjust system. On the 5th day, a land records expert presented maps showing how the Washingtons' property had been slowly chipped away over decades through minor encroachments that were too small to fight in court individually but added up to nearly 30 acres of lost land. In light of this history, the expert explained, pointing to the maps projected on the courtroom wall, Solomon Washington's covenant was proportional and reasonable. It was designed to make any future land theft so costly that no one would attempt it. By the time Amara delivered her closing argument, even some of Richard's attorneys looked concerned. The case that had seemed straightforward to them a week earlier now appeared to be slipping away, their confident expressions replaced with worried frowns. In the back of the courtroom, James Washington sat quietly, his hands folded over the top of his cane, watching as the truth his family had protected for a century finally had its day in court. The community center at Meadowbrook Estates was packed beyond capacity. Neighbors who had barely spoken before now sat shoulder to shoulder in folding chairs, while others stood against the walls. The mood was tense as Eliza Jenkins stepped up to the microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice slightly shaky. "As most of you know by now, our community is facing a serious situation." A projector displayed photos of the courthouse and news headlines about the ongoing trial. Whispers spread through the crowd as people pointed at the images. "The truth is," Eliza continued, "about half of our development, including 87 homes, the pool, and the tennis courts, was built on land that legally belongs to the Washington family. It was never purchased by the developer." The room erupted. A man in the front row stood up, his face red with anger. "I put my life savings into this house. How could this happen?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Eliza said, raising her hands to calm the crowd. Crestview Partners is fighting this in court, but she hesitated. Their lawyers aren't optimistic. A young mother near the back called out, "What does this mean for us? Will we lose our homes?" The room fell silent, everyone waiting for an answer. Eliza looked to Richard Whitman, who sat uncomfortably at the side of the stage. He stepped forward reluctantly. "We're exploring every legal option," he said, his usual confidence noticeably absent. "But yes, there is a possibility that the covenant could be enforced, which would mean—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Chaos broke out again. Some people shouted questions, others began to cry, and a few stormed toward Richard with pointed fingers and angry words. In the midst of the commotion, an older woman stood up. She had moved to Meadowbrook just 3 months earlier and rarely spoke at community events. "Has anyone actually talked to Mr. Washington?" she asked, her voice somehow cutting through the noise. Not the lawyers, but the homeowners. The actual people affected. The room grew quiet again. "I did," said a man near the middle, standing slowly. He was a history teacher at the local high school. "After I heard about the lawsuit, I drove over and introduced myself. We talked for almost 2 hours. People turned in their seats to look at him. And someone prompted. And he's not what you might expect," the teacher said. "He showed me pictures of his family going back 5 generations on that land. He talked about his great-grandfather Solomon like he was still alive, telling stories about how he built the first house by hand, how he dug the well that still provides water today." The teacher looked around the room. "Mr. Washington doesn't seem interested in taking our homes. He seems interested in making sure his family's story isn't erased." From the back of the room, a voice spoke up. "He's here." Heads turned to see James Washington standing quietly by the door, leaning on his wooden cane. The crowd parted as he made his way slowly to the front. Eliza quickly offered him the microphone. For a long moment, James just looked out at the faces before him, worried homeowners whose futures hung in the balance because of something that had happened long before most of them were born. "I've lived on my land for 68 years, he began, his voice clear despite his age. "Watched your houses go up one by one. Watched your children play in what used to be my family's fields." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I don't blame you for what happened. You bought these homes in good faith, but the land beneath them has a history that can't be ignored." A tense silence filled the room. "My great-grandfather Solomon was born a slave," James continued. "When he was finally able to own land, he protected it fiercely because he knew what it meant to have something taken from you against your will." He looked around the room, making eye contact with various homeowners. "I understand what your homes mean to you, because that's how my family has felt about our land for 100 years. From somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a child's voice piped up. "Are you going to take our house, mister?" James's face softened. "No, little one, that's not what Solomon would have wanted." He turned to address the whole room again. "But there is something he would have wanted, and that's for his story, our story, to be remembered." As the meeting continued late into the night, something unexpected began to happen. The anger in the room slowly transformed into something else. Homeowners who had arrived ready for a fight found themselves listening to James's stories. Some even shared their own family histories. What had started as 2 sides in a bitter legal battle was becoming a conversation about history, justice, and what it meant to truly be a community. By the time the meeting ended, a small group of homeowners had volunteered to work with James to find a solution that honored both his family's past and their community's future. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Wilson entered. 6 weeks of testimony had led to this moment. James Washington sat calmly at the plaintiff's table, his granddaughter Amara beside him. Across the aisle, Richard Whitman and his team of attorneys looked tense, their earlier confidence long gone. "In the matter of Washington versus Crestview Partners and Meadowbrook Estates," the judge began, adjusting his glasses, "I am prepared to deliver my ruling." The silence deepened. In the gallery, homeowners from Meadowbrook Estates held hands or leaned forward, their futures hanging on the judge's next words. After careful review of all evidence presented, this court finds that the covenant created by Solomon Washington in 1923 is legally valid and enforceable under state law. The judge paused as gasps and whispers filled the room. He raised his hand for silence. Furthermore, the court finds that Crestview Partners did indeed build on Washington land without permission. According to the terms of the covenant, the Washington family has the legal right to claim ownership of all structures built upon their property, including 87 homes and various community facilities. Tears began to flow from some of the homeowners. A few looked down at their hands, shoulders slumped in defeat. But James Washington's expression remained unchanged. The defendants have 180 days to reach a settlement agreement with the Washington family, or ownership will transfer as stipulated in the covenant. Court is adjourned. The judge's gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo the finality of his decision. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around both parties, shouting questions. Amara stepped to the microphones first. "We're pleased that the court has recognized the legal validity of Solomon Washington's covenant," she said. "But I want to be clear about something. My grandfather has never wanted to take people's homes. We will be working with the homeowners to find a solution that honors both justice and compassion." 3 weeks later, a very different meeting took place on the Washington property. Under a large oak tree that Solomon had planted nearly a century ago, James sat at a round table with Eliza Jenkins, 4 other homeowners, Richard Whitman, and representatives from the county government. "I've given this a lot of thought," James said, spreading out a hand-drawn map. "And I've spent time talking with many of your neighbors." He pointed to different areas on the map. "Here's what I propose. First, we acknowledge the historical truth. A monument will be placed at the entrance of the community, telling Solomon Washington's story and how this land came to be." The others nodded, having already discussed this idea in previous meetings. Second, James continued, the Homeowners Association will establish a scholarship fund for local students, with preference given to descendants of families who were enslaved in this county. Eliza made a note on her pad. "The board has already voted to approve this. We've secured commitments for the initial funding." And third, James said, his finger moving to a wooded area at the edge of the development, "This portion of my land will become a community park and historical site, with educational displays about black land ownership after the Civil War." "What about the homes?" Richard asked, the question everyone had been waiting for. James looked him directly in the eyes. "The homeowners will keep their homes," he said simply. "But each property built on Washington land will include a small annual fee with their HOA dues, not paid to me personally, but to a foundation that will support black businesses and education in this county for generations to come." Relief washed over the faces around the table. "My great-grandfather didn't create his covenant out of greed," James explained. "He created it so that someday someone would have to listen. And you have listened." Later that afternoon, as the meeting concluded, James walked slowly back to his house. On the porch waited a surprise. A group of children from Meadowbrook Estates and their parents, holding a large, gift-wrapped package. "We wanted to thank you," said one of the parents, stepping forward, "for finding a way to make this right." The children eagerly helped James unwrap the gift, a beautiful wooden bench with a small plaque that read, "In honor of Solomon Washington and his descendants, whose wisdom and forgiveness made this community possible." As James ran his hand along the smooth wood, a young boy asked, "Mr. Washington, will you tell us a story about your great-grandpa Solomon?" James smiled and settled onto his new bench. Solomon Washington was born in 1865, the year the Civil War ended, he began, as children and adults alike gathered around. He always said that being born into freedom gave him a special responsibility. And so the story continued, not just that day but for years to come. Solomon's legacy living on not through conflict, but through understanding, not through loss but through gain, not through division but through a community united by a shared history that was finally being told.